name is Tom Coleman, and I'm the Executive Director of Spectrum Institute. Today, I'll be having a conversation with Professor Barbara Kritchevsky about her activities as a law student and lawyer and professor over the years, starting in the 1970s. And this is a part of the Birds of a Feather project that we have, which is commemorating LGBT law students and lawyers in the decade of the 1970s, many of whom went on to continue with advocacy of various sorts on various issues. With that, I am going to ask Barbara to introduce herself to the audience.
I'm Barbara Kritchevsky. I'm a professor of law at the University of Memphis School of Law, where I've been since 1983. I grew up in the Philadelphia suburbs, went to Middlebury College in Vermont, graduated in 1977, then went to Harvard Law School and graduated in 1980.
So I'm wondering if we could start this walk down memory lane by having you tell us about your experiences in undergraduate school and then on in law school, but starting with undergraduate school, and especially your coming out process in undergraduate school and so on. And, just share with us your memories of that era.
For the first 3 years of college, I don't know that I ever really thought about sexuality, very frankly. I did my own thing, and I guess I assumed I was straight just because I didn't have any reason to think otherwise. And certainly back in the 70s, now we're dealing with the early 70s, there wasn't much indication in society that one might be something other than straight. I, had good friends, took the classes I liked, was very involved in school, didn't really pursue or have an interest in relationships. The one person who at the time may have considered a quote boyfriend, although we weren't intimate, is now an out gay man. So I think it was we attracted each other, and the lack of intimacy is now easily explained. The group we were hanging around with at the time, one was engaged to a man, another, I guess, was dating a woman, and the person who was engaged to a man is now married to a woman. So it seems like we found a gay group, even though we didn't really know. My senior year, there was a woman I fell in love with, and we took it from there. At the time, I really didn't know if that meant I was gay, if it meant I was bi, if it meant I was confused, because I think that was always the sort of narrative at the time was, oh, it's a phase, or you're confused, or if it was confusion, it's lasted for a very, very long time. I could take that as that I am gay. And so, it was really just the spring of my last year in college that I was, I guess, out, because everybody in my friend group knew really who was sleeping with whom. Then I graduated.
Now, when you applied to Harvard, did you give any thought to, being a open lesbian, what that would mean, or did you intend to be open? And then eventually, when you got into Harvard, what role did your sexual orientation play in anything? I guess you eventually joined a student group there and so on. So tell us about your law school experience.
Well, when I applied to law school, I didn't know. I certainly was not thinking in terms of anything related to sexuality when I applied to law school. But when I got there, though, things had changed a lot, because I had this very intense relationship that ended over the summer before I started law school. And so when I got to law school, I really knew nobody. I, at that point, did identify as gay and wanted to find some connection, some way to fit in, some group And also, I've just never been very good at lying or covering stuff up. So there are a few things that I think some of it's, actually very much sign of the times. One thing is I wanted to find some way of finding other gay people. And I was probably pretty naive from growing up in the suburbs and going to school in Vermont. So I didn't really know where to look. But there was a sign on the bulletin board, as I recall, for the Women's Law Association at law school that said there was going to be a meeting of lesbian law students in Boston, and had it was a potluck, had some sort of, I guess, phone number, address. But so that was my first sort of step into the world. It was in a way a rude awakening, because quite a few women at this potluck, there was a lot of anti-Harvard sentiment, a lot of, well, if you're Harvard, you think you're better than us. I'm not sure where that whole streak comes from. I bought a cake with me and realized that refined sugar was not in Boston at the time. So that was another wrong step. It was a time where there was a lot of very politicized lesbianism, or a lot of lesbians were very political. Some were separatists. There were sort of, people would say either you're a political lesbian or you're a sexual lesbian. I'm not in that. Some were just because it was trying to steer. I never quite understood it all. But bottom line, from this, I did make a few friends. One person who went to another law school who became pretty good friends with, who did then help me meet other people, who introduced me to the woman that I was in a relationship for probably at least most of my law school time, and a little bit once I graduated. That was sort of part of it, not directly connected to the school. Then I had some friends in school. I just told them I was gay. I didn't really know, just because I wasn't going to try and keep it a secret the whole time. One whose father, I guess, was a muckety-muck at some big corporation in Cincinnati, said her father told her to be careful of me. I had never known I was dangerous before, but I never really had any adverse. Well, two other things. One thing that I was very active in law school, even though it wasn't directly with Harvard, is, it's the Anita Bryant time, Harvey Milk realization, or at least to me, the realization that visibility was important. That a lot of people were anti-gay because they never knew gay people, and thought they'd know if they found one, they'd have like purple spots or something. It's like high school, we saw some video on sexually transmitted diseases, and all the people with gonorrhea had green spots. And it's like, oh, so that's how you know? And I think it's the same sense that there's some identifier. And there was a Gay and Lesbian Speakers Bureau. I'm not sure who ran it. I think through the Gay Community News newspaper in Boston. But I would go with a guy who was, I think, a social worker in Boston. But we just go to places and just say, here, we're gay, ask us questions. So we'd speak at high schools, college groups, all sorts of groups all over the city. We just sort of show up, and I mean, we were invited, obviously, but we'd, have like, seems a lot of the people who invited us were closeted high school teachers, but we'd go like to speak to their health ed class and just say, ask us anything. I found a lot of fun. I mean, yeah, you got some really offensive questions, but if you're just sort of calm and just answer it, it's people realize, gosh, they're just like us. I'd always dress pretty femme, so I'd wear skirts, and he was had a beard and stuff. We'd walk in and you'd hear these kids. I didn't know they had beards. I didn't know they wore dresses. And it was this sort of just countering these stereotypes. That was a lot of time, and I found a load of fun. Warren Burger, I guess, was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He was speaking at school, walked into the room where it was, and there were flyers, it's all pre-email, and flyers on all the chairs about a meeting of gay students that it turns out Jose Gomez had put on the chairs. And that was then the origin of, first Committee on Gay Legal Issues, and then it became Committee on Gay and Lesbian Legal Issues. Jose unfortunately passed away, but he's the one who got it going. But then you need that first step. And so that was another big activity. I was very involved. I was editor of the Women's Law Journal, which got started in conjunction with celebration of the 25th anniversary of women at Harvard. So plenty to keep me busy.
I remember reading something about you and Jose approaching the school about expanding its sexual orientation non-discrimination policy and the placement office and employers and so on. Tell us a little bit about that.
That's one of the few things directly associated with Cogley's that I really remember. There was anti-discrimination provisions for race. I believe there was for gender, although a real problem at the time was employers asking, are you going to have kids, and asking lots of very, now obviously illegitimate questions. But there was nothing on sexual orientation. So we went to ask the head of the placement office to include sexual orientation. Just went in, scheduled a meeting. As I recall, she was, at first quite cordial. And then we asked, explained what we were there for. And she's like, well, I just don't see, and she turns to Jose, if you went to an interview wearing a dress, I don't think you could expect to be hired. And we're like, no, we're not talking about some of the language I know we use in retro. It would not be used we're not talking about transvestites. We're talking about people who are gay and lesbian and want to be open. She's like, and I don't understand sex changes either. No, we're not talking about transsexual people. We're talking about, and I think it just sort of ended with a, we'll take it under advisement type thing. The ignorance was palpable. So I have to say, sexism was so tied in with, it's not just, there was, I'm not sure it was so much anti-gay as pure ignorance, but there was such sexism permeated so much that happened at Harvard at the time that it was sometimes hard to disentangle the two.
Now, were you involved at all when some of the students pressured the school about not allowing the military, or did that come after you left?
I think it came after I left. I don't remember. I remember it being an issue, but I don't remember any direct involvement in that.
So tell us also about the law review article that you published on artificial insemination, and what made you think about writing on that topic, and was there any resistance or probably not, because you were involved with the law journals and so on, but how did that all come about, and how was it received over the years?
I'm not really sure how it came about. I think we had to write a senior paper, as I recall. That was I originally wrote it as a paper that I got a grade on in my third year. what made me think of the topic? I'm really not sure, because I have never had children. I have never wanted children. I may have thought of it because I think there are two reasons I thought of it. One is a very good friend of mine in college found out that she had been born of artificial insemination. Her parents were married, but her father, I'm not sure, but at any rate, she was very sort of shocked when she found out in college that her father was not her biological father. And so that had caused me to talk about it some. And one of my good friends at school's mother was a nurse. She asked us to write some information for, she was in actually nursing education for student nurses on sexuality and sexuality from a legal standpoint. So the people going into nursing would have more familiarity than the average person did. And I think that may have also led to some thinking and talking about artificial insemination. But it struck my fancy. I was interested in con law, and I felt strongly, certainly, that family should not be, I'm not sure anybody really thought of gay marriage then, or it seemed that was beyond something I thought of at the time, but certainly the idea that family in whatever chosen form should get protection. You know, artificial insemination was certainly one way that a lot of people were expanding families that the law hadn't quite caught up to, as best I remember.
Okay.
But, I
All
wrote
right.
it, and then I thought I thought I might want to get into academia, which meant I needed to get something published. So once I graduated, since I've been working with the Harvard Women's Law Journal, I submitted as an article. They published it. Turns out probably to have been cited more than anything else I've ever written. It was quite timely, and evidently still shows up from time to time.
Now, when you graduated, you didn't go right into teaching. So what did you do first?
I worked for a large law firm in Philadelphia for 3 years. And that was the one time I went back into the closet. I certainly was not out on my resume. I think I was out as very feminist on my resume because of the Harvard Women's Law Journal, and I've worked for the ACLU for a summer, but there was nothing that suggested sexuality, at least overtly. As far as I know, there were no openly gay lawyers at the firm, and this was a firm that it was close to 100 people, and it just didn't seem very wise at the time as a very junior associate to be out. So I wasn't.
Then what made you transition to teaching?
I had always wanted to teach. I mean, I always thought as a kid I'd end up being a teacher. I thought maybe I'd end up going to grad school and teach college, but law degree was a lot safer than a PhD in political science. So, it had always been in the back of my mind. Big practice wasn't for me, not only because of the sort of stifling, out or not, I was not going to be married and belong to a country club and have kids and play golf and tennis and do what most of the people in the firm did. So I was always going to be an outsider. There's so much of practicing law is gamesmanship. If I could held up in the library, I sort of liked it, but dealing with clients and not being able to tell them that's really stupid. I sort of joke, what was a profession where I could get paid to tell people that what they were saying was stupid? And it's like, oh, law teaching. But a little more seriously, I had always wanted to teach, and I thought after 3 years, or then 2.5, if I were going to make the move that was the time. I had decided then I wasn't going to stay with the firm. I was thinking of maybe going in-house at a university, in-house counsel, but I grew up, my parents were academics too. I sort of grew up thinking I deserved summers off. I decided to see if I could break in, and I got a tenure track offer at Memphis, and non-tenure track office at a much more offer at in Seattle, which everybody thought I'd take because Seattle's a much more progressive town, but I was too nervous about not being tenure track, so I decided I'd go for it. I liked the people at Memphis. It seemed like it would be a good fit, and figured I'd leave after 3 years. 3 turned to 30, so I'm still here.
And what type of classes have you taught over the years?
I was hired at first to teach legal writing and administrative law. I taught constitutional law, taught criminal law, fed courts, torts. Now I teach civil rights litigation, which is sort of my baby, and legal argument and appellate practice, advanced brief writing, and appellate ad. So mostly appellate ad, brief writing type work, and Section 1983, which is my substantive area. I've done a fair amount in torts also.
Now, in terms of especially con law or civil liberties and even appellate law and so on, have LGBT issues been involved in any of that?
They certainly were when I taught con law, because I, taught con law back, first post Bowers, before Lawrence. I'm not even sure I was still teaching con law after Lawrence. And so there were certainly discussions on equal protection and gay rights. So it would come up. It comes up a little bit in what I do, but it's never been a chief teaching or academic interest. I think I don't know, it just, in terms of scholarly interest, it just hasn't been something that I've really gotten involved in.
I read somewhere that you were so passionate about moot court. Tell us about that.
Moot court's a big deal at a lot of law schools. It's, law school sports, the fake appellate, fake Supreme Court arguments, basically. And I got involved like my 5th year at Memphis with the moot court board as an advisor, and then started working with some of the teams. And so I now coach really 3 teams a year and spend a lot of time going to competitions. I guess it's an outlet for my competitive side. And to me, it's sort of teaching in the purest sense, because you're working very closely with a few people and really trying to get something as good as you can. It's like this, workshopping a play to get on Broadway, or training for some sort of, for the Olympics. It just becomes a very intense, how can we get this better? I don't know. It's just something that I've really, really enjoyed. So that's sort of been my niche.
Has there been a LGBT student group at your school ever over the years? Do you have one now?
We do have one now. There's been one sort of off and on. It's interesting. When I first got to Memphis, I didn't say I was gay on my resume, but I think a close reading could have led to that. I was fortunate, I guess, on my callback interview to, professors take you out to dinner. So 2 professors who took me out, one had, I guess, decided I was gay, and while he wasn't going to come out and ask me, was trying to sort of steer the conversation that way. The other, I think, was trying to show off that he was too cool also. So we had this I mean, actually, very interesting discussion about the state of the gay community in Memphis in 1983. And, as I was telling people, and they're like, no, it's like, I don't know, maybe it's just, it ended up sort of being on the table very early. I came out to a few people really as soon as I got here for, it's the same thing. I'm not gonna let people try and set me up on dates with guys. It's like, I'm not gonna just keep saying, oh no, I'm busy that night. So it's like, I'm not, I don't do guys. There were people who I probably never told directly, but I think word travels fast. It's a small school. Everybody always knew, or at least most people knew. Those who weren't sort of willfully ignorant, I think, knew. Like my first year, I know there were some very senior professors, one of whom I overheard talking about how his sister was a doctor and her nurse, she retired, but that meant her nurse would be out of a job. So her nurse moved in with her, just like a sister. And I remember thinking in my office, no, not just like a sister. No, that's just like a sister.
Did any of the gay students come to you at all for advice or?
It's interesting because at the time, even then there wasn't a gay student group, but there were a few quite out students, and I think people just had me pegged. Would talk to me, and I was not much older. I was younger actually than most of the students when I started teaching. I was 28, and a lot of the students had been out for a few years. So when I first started, it was a little different. Now, when there's maybe a 35-year age difference, we were all pretty much the same age. I was always sort of a little careful, I think, what I said, or tried to be. I probably wasn't as careful as I should be in retrospect.
I was reading somewhere that something of an organization asked the school if there were any out professors or whatever, and as a result, you gave them permission to list you on the website or something.
I'm not sure anybody asked. I know at one point when I was associate dean, someone asked, it was an interim dean, if there were any gay faculty. He said, yes, my associate dean is. He never asked me. I'm not sure I told him, but everybody knew. For like the first half of my time at Memphis, I was in a relationship, and everybody knew about the relationship. Everybody knew that if I were going somewhere, she was going too. So at the time, there was a lot of sort of visibility. I just treated her like everyone's spouse, treated their spouses. After we broke up, I think all the students know just because of everybody talks, but it doesn't come up quite as much, although sometimes it comes up, and I'm not. There's now a very out lesbian professor here who worked on the Bergerfeld litigation in Tennessee when it was going up. So now I'm the OG lesbian. I'm not the hip young one anymore.
Well, I'd like to ask you, if considering the era we're in now, where there's like some slippage in terms of LGBT rights or threats of rollbacks and so on, and also where you have a lot of young people who just kind of take for granted the rights that we enjoy today. If you have any, as an out legal professional or a professor, or just based on your life history and the era in which you were came out and so on, if you have any message to them or words of advice or caution or anything you'd like to share with the current LGBT law students and lawyers, both looking back and looking forward.
I mean, one thing I will say, it's sort of going back to what you're saying, we now do have a gay student group. Started one. I know I worked with students to start one, and it's sort of been off and on depending on where the students are. It's currently pretty active. I've been surprised very pleasantly at the number of straight students who have outlaw as something on their signature, sort of signature block or resume. So I think one thing that I've noticed is much more sort of allyship, that there are people who are not just do, at least the students who tend to hang out with me, I guess, or who I work with in moot court, tend to be very open, but there's, people are visible allies, which is important. I think it's important as politicians try to drive wedges that people refuse to be, put on one side or another, and that who one sleeps with, doesn't affect what one thinks good policy should be. I think otherwise, though, I guess my advice is be yourself, find a niche, figure out where you belong. It's not always where you may think. Tennessee is certainly not gay friendly, but Memphis itself is as blue as any city in the country. And the law school is a good fit for me, despite the fact that it makes me a little sick to know I live in Tennessee. But I think in terms of finding a fit for a career that's been very rewarding, things worked out, and it was sort of the same in law school. Don't fall for this pressure to do what people tell you should do or pursue what people tell you to pursue. Try to be yourself and figure out where you belong and how you can do some good. I think, there's lots of ways of helping. Times I probably feel guilty for not being super activist, but I think, training people to be good lawyers and fairly represent and think through things rigorously and not fall for, garbage and stuff. I think that is valuable too. I guess it's, find your niche. That's my best advice.
Good. I think that's great. Be yourself, find your niche, don't be pressured, open up to having allies and working with allies. We're all in this together. I think that's a very good message for people. And everyone doesn't have to be leading the parade or in the newspapers as an out person and so on. There's a place for each of us in all variations of society and contributions and so on. So is there anything else that you would like to add before we end the interview?
Can't think of anything else offhand.
I've really enjoyed the conversation today, and there's many other people like you from the 70s that their bios will be in the memory book that we're publishing. Not everybody was in the headlines. Not everyone was well known in LGBT political circles. There are many people just like you that their contribution was being themselves, being, open in a natural way, just being excellent in what they did. And that's a huge contribution to society, and especially with you helping to forge new lawyers through what you're doing, not just teaching, but the moot court and all the variations of what you've done through the law school. Your legacy is going to be what those individuals do as they move forward. So anyway, I'd like to thank you for everything that you've done and spending the time today with this conversation.